The jets had fuel gauges, the refugees had none. On June 27, 1950, while America's brand new P-80 Shooting Stars burned through their tanks and turned tail for Japan after just 15 minutes over Korea, one ugly, double-bodied, propeller-driven freak of engineering refused to leave, and it was the only thing standing between hundreds of terrified civilians and a North Korean firing squad. This is the story of the F82 Twin Mustang, the plane everyone laughed at, the plane the Air Force tried to scrap, and the plane that scored the first aerial kill of the Korean War while the future sat on the tarmac, waiting for the rain to stop. At 11:50 in the morning on June 27, 1950, Lieutenant William Hudson sat in the left seat of a freak show. He was hovering over Kimpo airfield in South Korea, staring down at a massacre waiting to happen. Hudson wasn't flying a jet. He wasn't in one of the sleek, sexy P-80 Shooting Stars that the Air Force loved so much. He was strapped into an F82 Twin Mustang, a plane that looked like a drunk engineer's mistake. It had 2 fuselages, 2 tails, and 2 cockpits, all welded together by a central wing. To the pilots of the new jet age, Hudson looked like he was driving a tractor to a Formula One race. But right now, that tractor was the only thing standing between hundreds of American civilians and a North Korean firing squad. Below him, the airfield was a scene of controlled panic. Massive C-54 Skymaster transport planes were lined up on the runway like elephants, their engines turning, waiting to load the terrified diplomats, women and children who were fleeing the invasion. The air smelled of burning oil and fear. The North Korean army was closing in, and their air force was hunting. Soviet-made Yak fighters were prowling the clouds, looking for easy targets. A C-54 loaded with refugees wasn't a target. It was a piñata. It was big, slow, and defenseless. If those transports took off without protection, they would be slaughtered before they reached the coast. Hudson knew the score. The American commanders on the ground were screaming into their radios, begging for air cover. They needed fighters to sweep the sky clean. But the Americans had a problem. It wasn't a problem of courage, and it wasn't a problem of firepower. It was a problem of geography. The nearest American air bases were in Japan, over 300 nautism away across the Sea of Japan. That doesn't sound like far, but in the summer of 1950, 300 nautism was a death sentence for logistics. The United States Air Force had spent the last 5 years falling in love with the jet engine. They had built fleets of P-80 Shooting Stars. These were the Ferraris of the sky. They were fast, smooth, and futuristic. But the P-80 had a fatal flaw. It was thirsty. The early jet engines drank fuel the way a sailor drinks beer on shore leave. They burned through gallons every second. A P-80 taking off from Japan would burn half its fuel just climbing to altitude and crossing the water. By the time it arrived over Kimpo airfield, the pilot would look at his fuel gauge and see the needle hovering near empty. He would have maybe 15 or 20 minutes of loiter time. Time to actually fight before he had to turn around and race back to Japan. If he stayed for 21 minutes, he was swimming home. The pilots called it bingo fuel. It was the moment the math told you that you were leaving, whether you wanted to or not. Hudson watched as the P-80s roared in, looking invincible. They scared the North Koreans for a few minutes, but then one by one, they had to bank away. The pilots were cursing in their cockpits, watching the fuel lights flicker. They had to leave the transports defenseless because their high-tech engines were starving. The refugees on the ground watched the silver jets disappear back toward the ocean. They were alone again. The Yak fighters saw the jets leave. They dipped their wings and turned back toward the helpless transport planes. That was when Hudson and the other twin Mustangs stepped in. They didn't have to leave. They had arrived from Japan, and they could stay. They could orbit Kimpo airfield for hours. They could fight all day and still have enough gas to fly home, have dinner, and fly back. While the jets were slaves to their fuel pumps, Hudson's twin Mustang was the king of endurance. The freak had arrived to do the heavy lifting. To understand why the United States Air Force would build such a strange machine, you have to go back to the darkest days of the Pacific War. In 1943 and 44, the Americans were fighting a war of distances that the Europeans couldn't even comprehend. The Pacific Ocean is a desert of water. The missions were 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours long. The B-29 Superfortress bombers were flying thousands of miles to hit the Japanese homeland, but they were dying in droves because no fighter plane could go with them. The P-51 Mustang was a miracle, but even a miracle has limits. A pilot in a single-seat fighter is a prisoner of his own biology. Sitting in a cramped cockpit for 8 hours is torture. You can't stand up. You can't stretch. You are vibrating with the engine. The noise is deafening. The cold is biting. After 6 hours, your brain starts to shut down. You get pilot fatigue. Your reaction times drop. You start making mistakes. And if you run into a Japanese Zero after flying for 7 hours, you are going to lose because you are exhausted and he is fresh. The Air Force needed a solution. They needed a fighter that could fly for 2,000 meters, fight a war, and then fly 2,000 back. They asked the engineers at North American Aviation to do the impossible. The engineers looked at the P-51 and asked a simple question. What if we brought a friend? What if we put two pilots in the same plane but gave them their own space? The result was the F-82. Critics mocked it immediately. They called it double trouble. They called it the Siamese twin. They said it was just a gimmick, a way to sell two planes for the price of one. They joked that if the pilots got into an argument, they would tear the wing off trying to turn in different directions. But the design was actually a masterpiece of pragmatism. It wasn't just two Mustangs bolted together. The F-82 was a completely new aircraft that shared the DNA of its predecessor, but had the stamina of a freight train. The genius was in the shift work. In a long-range mission, the pilot in the left cockpit, where Hudson was sitting now, would fly the plane for 4 hours. The pilot in the right cockpit wasn't just a passenger. He had a full set of flight controls, but he also had a secret weapon. His seat could tilt back. He could disengage his controls, lean back, and sleep. He could read a book. He could eat a sandwich. He could rest his brain. Then, halfway to the target, they would switch. The rested pilot would wake up, take the stick, and the tired pilot would nap. It meant that when the Twin Mustang arrived over Tokyo, or 5 years later over Korea, the pilot at the controls was fresh. He was sharp. He was ready to kill. It was a flying dormitory armed with 650 caliber machine guns. But in the late 1940s, as the jet age dawned, the Twin Mustang became the ugly duckling. It was a propeller plane in a world that was obsessed with turbines. It was heavy. It was slower than the jets. The Air Force tried to retire it. They pushed it to the side, embarrassed by its propeller blades and its weird shape. They wanted the future, not this strange relic of the past. But war has a way of humiliating the futurists. When the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel, the future broke down. The fancy jets were useless without airfields close to the front. The war didn't need speed. It needed loiter time. It needed a plane that could hang around like a bodyguard. And that is why on that terrified morning at Kimpo, the refugees looked up and didn't see a sleek silver dart. They saw the Twin Mustang. Hudson looked down at the Yaks. He checked his fuel gauge. The needle was barely moving. He had all the time in the world. Hudson pushed the throttle forward. The twin Merlin engines roared in harmony. The plane didn't scream. It thundered. The F-82 wasn't graceful. It was a brute. It was a flying brick wall with guns. Hudson lined up on the lead Yak. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to make history. He was about to score the first aerial kill of the Korean War, and he was going to do it in a plane that everyone said shouldn't exist. The jets had gone home. The props were taking over, but the Yak pilot wasn't going to make it easy. He saw the strange double plane diving at him and pulled hard into a turn. He thought he was fighting a bomber. He thought the heavy American plane would be sluggish. He was wrong. To understand why Lieutenant Hudson was able to sit comfortably over a war zone while the high-tech jets were running for their lives, you have to look under the skin of the machine. The F-82 Twin Mustang was the victim of the greatest optical illusion in aviation history. To the casual observer and even to many pilots, it looked like a lazy salvage job. It looked like North American aviation had a surplus of P-51 fuselages left over from World War III and decided to weld them together to save money. The critics called it a Frankenstein monster, a stitched-together corpse of a dead era. But that was a lie. The F-82 was not two old planes glued together. It was a completely new species designed for a specific kind of misery. The engineers knew that the biggest enemy in a long-range war wasn't the Japanese or the Germans or the Russians. It was the human bladder. It was the human spine. It was the crushing boredom and physical pain of sitting in a vibrating metal box for 12 hours. You could build a plane that flew for a week, but the pilot would be dead or insane by the time he landed. The single-seat P-51 Mustang was a Cadillac, but after 8 hours it felt like a torture chamber. The F-82 was designed to solve the biological problem of the pilot. It was the first fighter plane that treated the human being as the weak link that needed to be protected. The secret was in the cockpit layout. In a standard fighter, you're strapped in tight. You can't move. In the Twin Mustang, the cockpit was a workspace. The pilot in the left seat flew the mission. He handled the takeoff, the navigation, and the combat. But the guy in the right seat wasn't just a passenger. He was a fully qualified pilot with a full set of controls. When the left seat pilot got tired, he didn't have to pop pills or slap his own face to stay awake. He just handed the controls over to the right seat. Crucially, the seats fully reclined. A pilot could pass controls, disengage rudder pedals, and sleep. Crews called it a flying dormitory, allowing them to fight fresh even after 14-hour hauls. This endurance turned the Pacific Ocean from a barrier into a commute, and the Air Force proved it. 3 years before the Korean War started, they pulled a stunt that should have been impossible. They took a twin Mustang named Betty Joe, filled it with gas, and took off from Honolulu, Hawaii. They pointed the nose east and didn't stop until they saw the Statue of Liberty. They flew 5,000 mi in 14 hours and 32 minutes non-stop, no refueling. The jet fighters of the day would have had to land 5 times to make that trip. The Betty Joe landed in New York, and the pilot hopped out, shaved, and looked ready for a night on the town. It was a demonstration of raw endurance that terrified the Soviet Union. It meant the Americans could launch an escort fighter from a base in Alaska, fly to Moscow, fight a battle, and fly home. But back over Kimpo airfield in 1950, Lieutenant Hudson wasn't thinking about records. He was thinking about ballistics. The North Korean Yak-9 pilot had made a fatal calculation. He saw the big, clumsy-looking American plane and assumed it flew like a bus. He assumed he could turn inside it. He assumed that because the F-82 was heavy, it was slow. The Yak pilot banked hard, trying to get on the tail of the transport planes, ignoring the twin fuselage monster diving at him. He was treating the Twin Mustang like a joke. He didn't know about the buzzsaw. Unlike the P-Min MUN-51, which mounted guns in the wings requiring bullet convergence, the F-82 centered all 650 calibers in the middle wing section. This eliminated the need for a kill zone. The guns fired a parallel solid pillar of lead. Whether the target was 50 or 500 YD away, if you pulled the trigger, it was getting hit. The F-82 solved this problem with brute force. Because the two fuselages were connected by a massive center wing section, the engineers mounted all 6 50 caliber machine guns right in the middle. They were packed together in a tight cluster directly on the center line of the aircraft. This changed everything. There was no convergence. The guns didn't have to angle inward. They fired straight ahead in a parallel stream. It wasn't a cone of fire. It was a solid pillar of lead. It was like holding a fire hose. It didn't matter if the target was 50 yards away or 500 YD away. Aluminum skin. They sat on the runways in Japan, polished and useless. The commanders looked at the weather reports and despaired. They had the most advanced air force in the world, and it was defeated by rain. But the Twin Mustang had another trick up its sleeve. The freak was ugly, but it was smart. The big pod hanging under the center wing wasn't a fuel tank. It was a radar array. And the guy in the right seat wasn't just a relief pilot, he was a radar intercept officer. The F-82 was an all-weather fighter. It didn't need to see the ground to kill. It could see through the clouds. It could see through the night. While the jet sat on the tarmac, the Twin Mustangs took off into the storm. They flew blind, relying on the green glow of the radar scope. They dropped down into the valleys, flying between the mountain peaks in the pouring rain. They hunted the North Korean convoys by radar, dropping bombs on tanks that thought they were safe under the cloud cover. They became the ghosts of the Korean mountains. The North Korean soldiers on the ground learned to fear the sound of the twin engines. They would hear the low rumble above the clouds, and then, without warning, the bombs would fall. The Twin Mustang crews were flying double shifts. They were exhausted, but they kept going because there was no one else. They were the fire brigade. Every time the line threatened to break, the call went out for the double tails. But the enemy was adapting. The North Koreans weren't stupid. They saw that the Americans were relying on this one specific type of plane to hold the line. They knew the jets were fast but short-legged. They knew the Twin Mustangs were tough but slow. So they decided to change the game. Intelligence reports started trickling in. The North Koreans were moving new assets to the front. They were bringing up more anti-aircraft guns. But worse than that, there were rumors of something else arriving in the theater. The Soviet Union was watching the conflict with interest. They saw the Twin Mustangs dominating the night and the bad weather. They decided it was time to test their own new toys. High above the Yellow River on the border between North Korea and China, the radar screens at the American listening posts started picking up new contacts. These weren't the slow, propeller-driven Yaks. These contacts were moving fast, incredibly fast. They were climbing at rates that shouldn't be possible. They were sweeping across the scopes at 600 mm pod. The operators checked their equipment, thinking it was a glitch. Nothing flew that fast. The Twin Mustangs had owned the sky for the first few weeks of the war. They had saved the refugees, they had stopped the tanks, they had proven the experts wrong, but the window of vindication was closing. The technology curve was about to catch up with them. The F82 was a champion boxer, tough and gritty, but it was about to step into the ring with a killer who brought a knife. Hudson and his squadron were patrolling near the front lines when they got the call. A massive formation of enemy aircraft was heading south, but the voice on the radio sounded different this time. It wasn't the calm, professional voice of a controller. It was the voice of a man who was seeing something he didn't understand. "Be advised," the controller said, his voice cracking with static. "Bogies are high and fast." "Repeat, bogies are very fast. They don't look like Yaks." Hudson looked out of his canopy. The rain had stopped, leaving the sky washed clean and blue. It was perfect flying weather, perfect dying weather. He checked his guns, he checked his fuel. He looked over at Fraser in the right seat. They had been fighting the easy war against the Yaks. Now the real war was arriving. The freak had proven it could fly across an ocean. Now it had to prove it could survive the future. By August of 1950, the Korean War had stopped being a retreat and started being a siege. The United Nations forces had been pushed all the way down to the bottom tip of the peninsula into a tiny box of land called the Busan Perimeter. It was a strip of dirt about 50 mirin wide and 80 mirin long. It was the Alamo with rice paddies. Inside the box, the Americans and their allies were fighting with their backs to the sea. Outside the box, the entire North Korean army was scratching at the door, trying to push them into the water. This wasn't a skirmish anymore. It was a meat grinder. The valleys were choked with T-34 tanks, and the hills were swarming with infantry. The American commanders on the ground were playing a desperate game of whack-a-mole. Every time they plugged a hole in the line, the North Koreans would punch another one 5 meters away. The ground troops were exhausted. They were running out of ammo. They were running out of men. They needed air support, and they needed it 5 minutes ago, but the physics of the war were still broken. The air bases inside the perimeter were overcrowded and under fire. The main air power was still flying from Japan, fighting the tyranny of distance. This was where the jet age hit a brick wall. The F-80 shooting stars would scream in from Japan, drop 2 bombs, fire a few rockets, and then immediately turn around. They were like tourists passing through a war zone. The soldiers in the trenches hated it. They would cheer when they saw the silver jets arrive, and then curse when they saw them leave 10 minutes later. A tank column doesn't stop just because the airplanes ran out of gas. The North Koreans learned to time it. They would wait for the jets to fly away, and then they would attack. They called the interval between American airstrikes the killing time. But there was one plane that didn't leave. The F-82 Twin Mustang became the angel of the Busan Perimeter. The pilots of the 68th and 339th Fighter Squadrons were flying missions that would have killed a normal man. They weren't flying for 2 hours. They were flying for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours at a stretch. They were taking off from Japan, flying across the water, and then parking themselves over the battlefield like circling hawks. They refused to go home. Lieutenant Hudson and his radar operator were in the thick of it.